If you had told me 2 years ago that a 30-year career as a corporate director would end with me sitting on a concrete bench in Copacabana, physically broken and begging for loose change from the exact type of tourists I thought I was vastly superior to, I would have laughed in your face, Dot. But that is exactly what happened, Dot. Right now, I am looking out the frosted window of a 400 square foot subsidized apartment in Ohio. The radiator is rattling, the sky is a flat, unforgiving gray, and the silence in this room is absolute. On the cheap Formica counter behind me sits a pair of heavy brass keys. They are completely useless. They supposedly belong to a breathtaking oceanfront penthouse in Ipanema, a property I thought I bought for $320,000 in a brilliant all-cash deal. I kept those keys even after the U.S. Embassy had to step in and repatriate me. I keep them as a quiet, daily reminder of the exact price of my own vanity. I didn't lose my entire life savings to a sudden market crash, a bad corporate investment, or a medical emergency. I lost 3 decades of disciplined, hard-earned wealth for a much simpler, much more pathetic reason. I was an aging, divorced man terrified of becoming invisible. I felt my youth slipping away. I felt entirely irrelevant, and I desperately wanted to purchase a reality where I was finally the powerful, attractive winner I felt I deserved to be. Before my time ran out, I thought I was making the smartest, most sophisticated move of my life. I had the spreadsheets, I tracked the exchange rates, I translated the contracts line by line. I genuinely believed my decades in corporate supply chain management made me too sharp to fail, too rational to be played in an emerging market. I was completely wrong. And the hardest part to swallow today isn't that the money is gone forever, or that my chest still aches from the heart attack that followed. The hardest part is knowing with painful clarity that the warnings were there from the very first day. I just chose to close my eyes to every single one of them, because the lie I was being sold felt so much better than the truth of who I actually was. I was not an impulsive man. If you want to understand how this happened, you have to understand that first. For 30 years, I was the director of supply chain for a mid-sized manufacturing firm right here in Ohio. Do you know what a supply chain director actually does? I was in the business of anticipating failure. My entire career was built on looking at a complex logistical web, finding every single point where a system could collapse, and building contingencies. I spent my days vetting international suppliers, auditing vendor histories, and tearing apart 100-page contracts looking for hidden liabilities. I didn't gamble. If a vendor's numbers didn't align down to the 100th of a cent, or if their corporate registry looked even slightly off, I cut them loose. I lived my life inside spreadsheets, guided by strict, unforgiving logic. I was the guy everyone went to when they needed a rational, emotionless decision. And I applied that exact same ruthless pragmatism to my personal life. I was always the responsible guy. I didn't take wild vacations. I invested in low-risk index funds. When my 25-year marriage ended, not with screaming or broken plates, but with a quiet, mutual sigh of utter exhaustion, I didn't go out and buy a sports car. We divided our assets calmly. I walked away with $380,000 in liquid retirement savings and a guaranteed pension of $2,000 a month. I was 58 years old. Financially, I was perfectly secure. In a Midwestern suburb, that kind of money meant I could stay in my modest house, keep the thermostat at a reasonable temperature, and safely run out the clock until the end of my life. But that was exactly the problem. The clock was just running out. After the divorce was finalized, and after my 2 kids had grown up, moved away, and reduced our communication to obligatory text messages on holidays, my house became unbearably quiet. I would wake up at 6 a.m. out of pure corporate habit, pour a cup of black coffee, and just sit at the kitchen island, staring at the snow piling up in the driveway. I had done everything right. I had played strictly by the rules my entire life. I had been the steady provider, the loyal company man, the dependable father, and my reward was an overwhelming, crushing sense of invisibility. You don't realize how heavy irrelevance feels until it settles into your bones. I would go to the grocery store, walk the aisles, pay the cashier, and realize on the drive home that it was the first time I had spoken out loud to another human being in 3 days. I looked in the mirror and saw a man whose youth had been traded for corporate stability. I didn't feel like a winner. I felt like a ghost. I didn't want to just fade away in a cold Ohio suburb, waiting to die in a house nobody visited. I was desperate for a second act. I wanted to feel powerful. I wanted to feel vital. I wanted to prove to my ex-wife, to my distant kids, and mostly to myself, that all those decades of quiet discipline had actually amounted to something spectacular. I wanted, just once in my life, to be the man everyone else envied. I thought my intellect and my 30 years of risk management would protect me as I went looking for that feeling. I didn't realize that when you are starving to be seen, your ego will completely bypass your brain. The actual decision to leave didn't happen overnight. It was born out of hundreds of hours sitting alone in the dark, watching the glow of my laptop screen. Like a lot of lonely men, I had fallen down a YouTube rabbit hole. The algorithm, somehow sensing my exact demographic and level of despair, started feeding me videos about something called geo-arbitrage. The premise was intoxicatingly simple, and more importantly, it was framed as a financial strategy rather than a midlife crisis. The videos featured men my age, but tanned, smiling, wearing linen shirts, explaining how a middle-class retirement in the United States could translate into absolute luxury in an emerging market. To a supply chain director, this wasn't a desperate escape. It was simply an optimization of resources. I was treating my own life like a distressed corporate asset that needed to be relocated to a more favorable jurisdiction. I opened a new spreadsheet. I started tracking the Brazilian real against the US dollar. At the time, the exchange rate was hovering around 5 to 1. I looked at my numbers. $380,000 in liquid capital and a guaranteed $2,000 a month from my pension. In Ohio. That math meant clipping coupons, worrying about the rising cost of heating oil, and dying quietly in a house that smelled like old carpet. But in Rio de Janeiro, if I bought a property outright, eliminating rent or a mortgage, that $2,000 a month would place me securely in the upper middle class. I wouldn't just be surviving. I would be a man of means. I would be someone who mattered. The logic felt airtight. It was so mathematically sound that it completely masked the massive, gaping emotional void that was actually driving the car. I put the Ohio house on the market in early October. It sold in 3 weeks. When I texted my 2 children to tell them I was moving to South America, my daughter replied with a thumbs-up emoji and a wow crazy, be safe. My son didn't reply until the next day. Their indifference should have hurt, but instead, I used it as fuel. I told myself I was cutting dead weight. I was stepping out of the background of my own life. 2 months later, I landed at Galeão International Airport. I had booked a short-term ocean view Airbnb on Avenida Atlantica in Copacabana to serve as my base of operations. I remember stepping out onto the mosaic sidewalks that first morning. The contrast was physically staggering. Just 48 hours prior, I had been shoveling gray slush off my driveway in freezing temperatures. Now the air was thick, warm, and smelled of salt and grilled meat. The streets were vibrant, chaotic, and entirely alive. For the first few weeks, I felt like an absolute genius. I woke up early, drank strong local coffee, and walked the beach. I spent my afternoons scouting neighborhoods and analyzing real estate listings with the same clinical precision I used to audit manufacturing plants in Shenzhen. My plan was set in stone. Find an undervalued luxury property, buy it in cash to secure a steep discount, and spend the rest of my days living a high-status lifestyle that would have cost millions back home. I felt incredibly secure. I had done the math. I knew the market trends. I was an American corporate veteran holding strong currency in a weaker economy. I held all the cards. What I didn't realize as I sat on my Airbnb balcony, watching the sun set over the Atlantic and feeling a dangerous surge of unearned confidence, was that I had completely miscalculated my own risk profile. I thought I was shopping for real estate. In reality, I was a wealthy, isolated, desperate man wandering into a complex ecosystem, broadcasting my loneliness to anyone trained to look for it. I was the perfect mark. I just thought I was the smartest guy in the room. I found the event on an expat Facebook group. It was billed as a networking mixer for international investors at a high-end boutique hotel in Ipanema. I remember putting on my best linen jacket, the one I had bought specifically to look like a man who belonged in a place like this, and walking into a room full of loud, sunburned men complaining about the local bureaucracy. I stood near the bar, nursing a 30-reel gin and tonic, already feeling that familiar heavy wave of isolation creeping back in. Then she walked up to me. Her name was Isabella. She was 34, wearing a tailored slate-gray silk blazer, and she spoke English with the precise, rhythmic cadence of someone who had been educated in Europe. She didn't look like the women hanging around the tourist bars on the boardwalk. She looked exactly like the corporate executives I used to negotiate with in Geneva. "You look entirely bored by these people," she said, leaning against the brass railing next to me. I laughed, caught off guard, and asked what brought her there. She handed me a heavy, matte black business card. It identified her as a boutique real estate consultant specializing in off-market assets for foreign portfolios. What struck me first wasn't just that she was staggeringly beautiful, though she was in a very understated, elegant way. What struck me was how she looked at me. She didn't look at my graying hair or the exhaustion around my eyes. She looked at me with a kind of sharp, appraising respect. "Most of the men in this room are amateurs," she whispered, nodding toward a group of loud Americans. "They want to buy cheap beachfront condos and play tourist. But you have the aura of a man who actually understands how emerging markets work." It was exactly what I wanted to hear. Looking back, I can see it was a masterfully targeted strike at my exact psychological vulnerability. But at the time, I just thought she was incredibly perceptive. I felt seen. She didn't try to sell me anything that night. In fact, when I asked about the local market, she waved her hand dismissively. "The public market is bloated," she said. "If you see a listing online, the real money has already been made." Instead, we spent the next 2 hours talking about global supply chain logistics. She asked intelligent, probing questions about my career. For the first time in a decade, I felt fascinating. The connection built rapidly over the next 2 weeks, systematically blurring the line between a professional relationship and something intensely personal. Isabella didn't take me to the crowded tourist traps. She took me to private social clubs tucked behind unmarked doors in Leblon and low-lit restaurants where the maitre d' greeted her by name. She would lean in close when she spoke, her hand occasionally brushing my arm to emphasize a point. She made me feel like an insider. She made me feel like I had bypassed the velvet rope of the city. And she completely disarmed my natural corporate skepticism through one simple, brilliant tactic. She never let me pay. On our third dinner, a 3-hour affair involving imported wine and fresh seafood, I pulled out my high-tier credit card. She physically pushed my hand down. "Arthur, please," she said, her tone almost offended. "You are my guest in my city. When we close a deal, you can buy the champagne. Until then, put your wallet away." To a man trained to spot scammers looking for a quick payout, this was the ultimate proof of legitimacy. A woman after my money wouldn't spend 1,000 reais on my dinner, I reasoned. She was investing in our relationship. A few days later, she introduced me to an older, distinguished man in a perfectly tailored suit at a cafe. She casually mentioned he was a high-ranking city official. He kissed her cheek, shook my hand warmly, and treated Isabella with a level of deference that cemented her status in my mind. She was connected. She was powerful. And for whatever reason, she had chosen me. It was only after she had entirely secured my trust, after she had made herself indispensable to my daily routine, that she finally mentioned the penthouse. We were sitting in my Airbnb when she opened her laptop and turned the screen toward me. It was a breathtaking property in Ipanema, floor-to-ceiling windows, a sweeping panoramic view of the ocean, private elevator access. "This is not on the market," she said, her voice dropping lower, creating a bubble of exclusivity around us. "It belonged to a very wealthy family, and it's tied up in a complicated probate, an inventario. The heirs are fighting, the taxes are piling up, and they are desperate to liquidate quietly. If someone can move quickly in cash, it can be acquired for 40% of its actual market value." My corporate instincts flared, but not with caution. They flared with adrenaline. This was exactly the kind of distressed asset play I had dreamed of. This was the geo-arbitrage I had flown 4,000 miles to find. I told her I wanted to see it immediately. She smiled, touched my knee gently, and said she would arrange it. There was only one minor detail she mentioned in passing as she packed up her laptop. Because of the delicate nature of the probate, we couldn't use a standard international escrow service. She insisted we had to use her family's private notary, a cartorio, to process the paperwork. "If we put this through the standard system, the Brazilian bureaucracy will freeze the transaction for 3 years, she explained, looking me right in the eyes with absolute sincerity. "This requires surgical precision. It was a deviation from standard protocol. In my previous life, it would have been a clear, glaring anomaly in the supply chain of a transaction, but as she stood up, leaving the faint scent of her expensive perfume in the room, I didn't see a red flag. I just saw the necessary cost of doing business in paradise, and I was thrilled to be the man capable of paying it. The shift from a professional arrangement to an intimate one didn't happen with a dramatic declaration. It was seamless, almost imperceptible. First, she left a silk scarf on the armchair of my Airbnb. Then, a few high-end cosmetics appeared on the bathroom counter. Within 10 days, Isabella had practically moved in. Waking up next to a beautiful 34-year-old woman while the Rio sun filtered through the blinds did something dangerous to my brain chemistry. I felt like I had reversed the aging process. One morning, as she was making espresso in the tiny kitchen wearing one of my dress shirts, she casually referred to me on a phone call as her future husband. She said it in Portuguese, assuming I wouldn't catch it, but I did. My chest swelled. For a man who had felt entirely invisible for a decade, those 2 words were a lethal dose of validation. Because I felt so powerful, so completely in control of my new life, the red flags didn't register as threats. They registered as minor logistical hurdles for me to solve. The first hurdle was the paperwork. The penthouse was tied up in that complicated probate, an inventario. To bypass the infamous Brazilian bureaucracy, Isabella explained, we couldn't use a standard escrow service. We had to process everything through her family's private notary, a specific cartorio downtown. She needed a $15,000 non-refundable legal fast-track fee to clear the bureaucratic hurdles and grease the right wheels. If a vendor in Ohio had asked me for a $15,000 unreceipted fee, I would have terminated their contract immediately. But I wasn't in Ohio. I told myself that emerging markets require unorthodox methods. In my corporate life, we paid expediting fees to foreign ports all the time. I convinced myself this was exactly the same thing. I transferred the $15,000 without blinking. But but my 30 years of auditing habits weren't entirely dead. One afternoon, while she was out, I quietly looked up her professional real estate license number, her CRECI, on the government registry. The number returned a match, but the name belonged to a man who had been deceased for 4 years. When I calmly brought it up over dinner that night, expecting an argument, she didn't even flinch. She took a sip of her wine, rolled her eyes at the incompetence of local government, and explained that she was operating under her late uncle's corporate registry while her new LLC was caught in an administrative backlog. If you want to wait 2 years for the city to stamp my new paperwork, we can, she said, her tone perfectly steady, slightly condescending. But the penthouse will be gone by Friday. She didn't get defensive. She challenged my tolerance for local reality, and because I so desperately wanted the reality she was offering, I accepted her explanation completely. I sat there in the restaurant translating the Portuguese purchase agreements line by line on my phone, falsely believing that because I understood the translated vocabulary, I understood the legal validity of the documents. I thought I was being thorough. I was just reading a very well-written script. The universe tried to warn me one last time. I was sitting at a coffee shop in Copacabana, reviewing my spreadsheets, when an American expat at the next table struck up a conversation. He was in his 60s, wearing worn-out cargo shorts and a faded t-shirt, exactly the kind of amateur Isabella had trained me to look down upon. He asked what brought me to Rio, and I proudly mentioned I was closing on a distressed probate property. The man stopped smiling. He leaned in and looked at me with genuine concern. "Brother, walk away," he said quietly. "Probate properties are the biggest trap down here. It's the oldest trick in the book for foreigners." I didn't feel gratitude for the warning. I felt deeply insulted. I looked at this sunburned, defeated-looking man and felt nothing but arrogant pity. "You're just a loser who doesn't have the high-level network I do," I thought. I paid for my coffee, offered a tight, polite smile, and walked away. I was so convinced of my own superiority that I mistook a lifeline for an insult. To finalize the deal, I needed to stage the funds. I had Isabella help me open a local bank account, navigating the Portuguese paperwork while I signed where she pointed. Then I called my financial advisor back in Columbus to liquidate my retirement accounts and prepare the wire transfer. My advisor had known me for 15 years. When I explained the plan, the line went dead silent. "Arthur," he finally said, his voice tense, "please listen to me. Do not wire your entire life savings to a foreign account for a woman you met 3 weeks ago. You are being horribly naive." He couldn't have chosen a worse word. Naive. It struck the absolute core of my insecurities. I wasn't a naive old man. I was a decisive international investor. I was a winner. The anger blinded me instantly. I didn't argue with him. I fired him on the spot. I ordered him to liquidate every index fund, every bond, every safety net I had built over 30 years. I cut the final cord, tying me to my old, safe life, entirely unaware that I was standing in the middle of a burning bridge, smiling at the flames. The push came on a Tuesday morning. It was raining, a sudden, violent tropical downpour that hammered against the glass of the Airbnb. We were sitting on the couch when Isabella's phone rang. She answered in Portuguese, her voice tight, pacing the floor. When she hung up, she looked at me with tears welling in her eyes. "I am so sorry, Arthur," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "The heirs, they are panicking. Another broker found out about the probate vulnerability. A Russian buyer just offered 10% over our agreed price in cash, closing tomorrow." She sat down next to me, visibly defeated, burying her face in her hands. "I tried to hold them off, but unless we wire the full $320,000 to the Cartorio's holding account by this afternoon to lock the deed, we lose it. I look back at that moment now, and the mechanics of the trap are so painfully obvious. The false urgency, the phantom competitor, the emotional manipulation. It is page one of every basic scam playbook. If a supplier in Shenzhen had pulled that exact maneuver on a Friday afternoon, I would have laughed and canceled the contract on the spot. But this wasn't a supplier. This was Isabella, sitting next to me in my t-shirt, crying over the loss of our shared future. I didn't feel panic. I felt a surge of absolute, intoxicating masculine power. This was my element. This was the high-stakes executive crisis I had spent my entire life preparing for. I wasn't an invisible, aging retiree in that moment. I was the decisive corporate director stepping in to save the day. "Don't worry," I told her, my voice steady and authoritative. "I'll handle it." I opened my laptop. I logged into the newly established local bank account that held the entirety of my liquidated life savings. My hand didn't shake. My pulse didn't race with anxiety. I felt a profound, almost euphoric sense of victory as I typed in the routing numbers for the notary's account. I wired exactly $320,000. I watched the screen refresh. The balance on the account plummeted to roughly $15,000. 30 years of discipline, of missed family dinners, of corporate stress and careful index fund management transferred away in a single click. When I showed Isabella the confirmation screen, she threw her arms around my neck. She kissed me, tears of relief on her cheeks, and whispered that I was the smartest, most incredible man she had ever met. In that exact second, if you had asked me, I would have told you that the $320,000 was the best investment I had ever made in my life. The validation came 2 days later, perfectly timed to solidify the illusion. Isabella walked into the apartment carrying a thick, beautifully bound leather folder. Inside was the escritura, the official deed. It was heavy, printed on thick parchment-like paper, covered in official-looking blue stamps, holographic seals, and a dozen illegible signatures. Right in the center, typed in bold, was my name, Arthur Pendleton. She also handed me a set of heavy brass keys. "Let's go home," she said. We took an Uber to the building in Ipanema. The doorman recognized us from our first visit, nodded respectfully, and led us into the private elevator. My key turned flawlessly in the lock of the penthouse door. The apartment was entirely empty, echoing with the sound of the ocean crashing against the beach across the street. We stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the endless expanse of the Atlantic. Isabella popped a bottle of imported champagne she had brought in her bag. We drank out of plastic cups, walking through the empty rooms. She pointed out exactly where we would put the custom Italian sofa, where the dining table would go, and which guest room we would prepare for my children when they flew down for Christmas. I stood on the balcony, feeling the warm ocean breeze against my face, holding a deed with my name on it and the waist of a beautiful woman who looked at me like I was a god. I had beaten the system. I had escaped the quiet, pathetic death of my old life. I had risked everything, and I had won. I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I was finally the man I had always deserved to be. I lived in that perfect, untouchable reality for exactly 1 week. The fracture happened on a Tuesday morning. I had hired a local contractor, a quiet, older man named Mendez, to meet me at the property to give me a quote for painting the master bedroom. We took the private elevator up in silence. I stepped out, offered Mendez a confident smile, and slid the heavy brass key into the lock. It went in smoothly, but it wouldn't turn. I jiggled it. I pulled it back a fraction of an inch and tried again. Mendez stood patiently behind me, his hands in his pockets. I was just about to force the handle when the elevator pinged. The doorman stepped out, accompanied by a man in a sharp navy suit. The doorman, who had smiled and tipped his hat to me a week ago, now looked at me with cold, hardened suspicion. He spoke rapidly in Portuguese, gesturing toward the door. The man in the suit held up a hand, silencing him, and looked at me. He spoke in perfect, unaccented English. "Who are you?" the man asked. "And why are you trying to break into my apartment?" I let out a polite, dismissive laugh. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick, beautifully bound escritura. "There's been a misunderstanding," I said, using my best corporate boardroom voice. "I closed on this property last week through the probate court. I have the deed right here." Right. The man took the document. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly, devastatingly pitying. He traced his thumb over the holographic seal, then handed it back to me. "This is a very expensive piece of art," he said quietly. "But it is a forgery. I am a corporate litigator. I have owned this unit for 12 years. There is no probate, and I have never listed it for sale." My chest went completely hollow. The silence in the hallway was absolute, broken only by the muffled sound of the ocean outside. I stepped away from the door, pulled out my phone, and dialed Isabella's number. My hands were perfectly steady, entirely numb. The automated Portuguese message was flat and metallic. "This number is no longer in service." I left Mendez and the lawyer standing in the hallway and took a taxi straight to the downtown Cartorio, Suite 402. The frosted glass door was unlocked. I pushed it open, ready to demand answers, but there was no one to demand them from. There was no notary, no reception desk, no files. It was just a bare room with scuffed hardwood floors and a single folding chair left in the corner. The building manager sweeping the hallway outside told me it had been rented out on a month-to-month cash lease. They had cleared it out over the weekend. The fall didn't happen all at once. It happened in agonizing, methodical stages. I spent the next 3 weeks in a manic blur, sitting in the polished offices of actual, legitimate Brazilian attorneys. They took my remaining $15,000 in retainer fees just to confirm the autopsy of my life. The money hadn't gone into a holding account. It had been funneled through 3 offshore shell companies and dumped into untraceable cryptocurrency tumblers within 20 minutes of me pressing the wire transfer button. "I am sorry, Senor Pendleton," the last lawyer told me, sliding my empty bank statements across his mahogany desk. "The money is gone, all of it, all of..." My brain finally processed the reality, but it was my body that surrendered to it. I was walking back to my Airbnb, mechanically calculating how I was going to afford my next meal, when an invisible, crushing weight slammed into the center of my chest. My left arm went cold. The mosaic sidewalk of Avenida Atlantica tilted violently, and I collapsed onto the hot concrete. I didn't wake up in a private luxury clinic. I woke up under the flickering, buzzing fluorescent lights of a crowded public hospital, the SUS. There were stretchers lining the hallways, and the heavy, humid air smelled of iodine and unwashed bodies. I lay there for 4 days, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, listening to the groans of the people around me. My heart had been physically damaged by the sheer, violent velocity of my own panic. When they finally discharged me, my legs trembled as I walked out into the glaring sun. I found my way back to the Airbnb, only to find the locks changed there, too. My short-term lease had expired while I was in the hospital bed. The building manager had packed my belongings into black garbage bags and left them in an unsecured basement storage closet. By the time I convinced him to let me look, my laptop, my watch, and my passport were gone. And that is how a 30-year corporate director, a man who prided himself on his untouchable intellect and rigorous risk management, ended up sitting on a concrete bench in Copacabana with literally nothing. No money, no identity, no health. Within 3 days, the hunger became sharper than the pride. I stood up, walked over to the boardwalk, and did the only thing I could do to survive. I held out my trembling hand, begging for loose riets from the sunburned American tourists in cargo shorts, the exact same men I had looked down upon, the amateurs I thought I was vastly superior to. They walked past me, averting their eyes, entirely uncomfortable with my existence, just like I would have done. It took the U.S. Embassy 3 weeks to process my emergency repatriation loan and put me on a commercial flight back to Ohio. Now I sit in this subsidized one-bedroom apartment. I live entirely off my $2,000 pension, which barely covers the rent, the heating bill, and the copays for my heart medication. I don't go out. I don't speak to my children because I cannot bear the shame of explaining to them what I have done. I look at those heavy brass keys on the Formica counter every single day. I don't hate Isabella. I don't curse the country of Brazil. I know exactly who is responsible. Isabella didn't steal my life savings. She just held up a mirror and showed me exactly what I desperately wanted to see. I was a lonely, aging man terrified of becoming irrelevant. I gladly paid $320,000 for the illusion that I was still powerful, still attractive, still a winner. I ignored every warning, every anomaly, and every basic instinct of survival because the quiet truth of my life was too heavy to carry, and the lie she told me was so beautifully loud.